Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to talk about what's new in Fusion for September 2024. Like most of our What's New videos, we are not talking about everything that's changed. I'll put a link to the blog post in the description of the video, and you can of course go to your help menu and go to What's New, and that will give you all the information you need. What I'm going to cover is mainly the design as well as the drawing updates, but there are some notable updates to things like manufacturing. So if you are creating toolpaths for CNC machining, then there are definitely a couple of great new updates in there. Things like using avoid and touch in the past, you had to pick one or the other. Now there are settings for things like avoid and touch in the same toolpath. Big improvements, especially if you're doing complex shapes and you're using a lot of 3D or multi-axis toolpaths. So for this video, let's start with the design tools. And the first thing that's been updated is Bevel. Now this Bevel tool inside of our form tools has been around, and obviously if you've subscribed to this channel and you've watched nearly any of our form content, you know that I use the Bevel tool all the time. This is the way that I make creased edges and I have harder details, harder edges on complex surfaces. So the big thing that's changed here is we've got a couple of new options. So this bevel width is a new option. In the past, we used what's called relative offset. I'm going to double click a couple of edges so we can kind of see how this works. And what we're going to do is we're going to view this from the front. So the relative offset option is basically a percentage or a ratio relative to the next edge. So if we set this to 0.5, for example, it's going to be 50% of the way between our selected edge and the next edge that's available. Generally, when we're doing things like car bodies and we're adding detail, we'll generally keep it around 0.05 or 0.1. Tends to create a pretty tight crease. Another thing that's changed by default, we now have two segments, where in the past we would have to sort of play around and configure the number of segments we wanted. And the main reason for this is because they've updated a couple of things. We now have a bevel width option, which allows us to configure a specific width for the edges that we're adding. And they've added what's called a crown option. Now this crown option becomes more apparent the more edges we add. But if I start to increase this crown value, it goes between 0 and 2. Basically what we're doing is we are changing the angle between the beveled edges. Now, the reason this is important is because in the past with this tool, we didn't have control over this. If we added any more than 2 segments, basically what you ended up getting was a bunch of flat sections. But now with this crown tool, what we can do is we can actually configure or change the transition quite a bit better. So if I say OK on this, you can see now we've got a pretty consistent transition for those new beveled edges. So this is a great update. I have found some limitations to this. I'm not 100% certain, but in the past, I feel like the bevel tool could work on any selected edges. So I would use it to insert edges in certain places. However, now when we use the bevel tool, it's not going to be available if we have an internal edge like this. It has to have a higher transition angle. And I don't know if that's a new thing, a change, or if it was like that before and I just never noticed. But I feel like we were able to use bevel on pretty much any edge in the past. So keep in mind, or just kind of keep an eye out for that. If you notice that as well, leave a comment and let me know. Hopefully, if it's just a bug, then that'll get fixed or changed. That's the only update or change to the forms environment, but since I use bevel all the time, I am looking forward to trying this out on some complex models. The next tool that's been updated is Sketch Offset. Now, this update is very welcome, but they came up just a little bit short on it, and I'll explain why. So let's just double click this shape, and we're going to use Offset. The new option here is called Two Sides, and we've also got this match topology, which I'll talk about in just a second. So the main thing that I think the mark was missed on is that we don't have the ability to turn the original selected curve into a construction line. Now, that's something that exists in other CAD packages with this tool, and I think that that would be a nice improvement if we can get the original selected entity to be construction. That would limit the number of selectable profiles that we have in the sketch. But so they've added the Two Sides option, which again is very helpful. They've added this link offsets option, and what this means is that the distance or the link value from one direction to the other will stay permanently linked together. What this means is that if we offset this 7 millimeters, D1 is going to be 7 and D2 will be negative D1. If we leave that unchecked, there'll be two independent dimensions. They'll match initially, but you can modify them independently. The other thing that's changed is this match topology. Now, in most cases, you might click this and never see anything happen. But the reason that's there is because if you get to a situation where, let's say, this fillet disappears, it's going to provide a warning. It's going to say the new geometry, the new topology, doesn't match the original selected curves because we no longer have a rounded corner there. So it'll prevent you from going past that amount. If you turn that off, it doesn't care and it'll just square off that corner for you. So in most cases, it's just kind of a nice to have. With a simple example like this, with just some straight lines and a fillet, then it doesn't really matter. But if you are dealing with complex curvature and you really don't want a sharp corner or transition, that can be nice to just prevent that from happening. So I'm going to go ahead and link the offsets here and say OK. Then I'm going to go to Modify, Change Parameters, and just expand my sketch. And we can see here that D6 is minus 7.3, blah, 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 blah. And then D7 is minus D6 because they were linked together. We can manually change that to 7.361 if we want. And that's basically what you would get if you don't link those values together. So I think that this is a great update. I really do wish that they would have made the original curve construction or at least had that option, because most of the time if I'm offsetting in two directions, that's what I'm going to do. There are a couple of other improvements to this tool. I feel like this is probably the tool that got the most amount of love on this update, but a couple of other things that happened. If we delete some of the original offset geometry, technically it's supposed to keep or maintain those references. You can see that it moved the dimensions to a different edge, but you'll notice that things are now underdefined. So this is something that I think in theory is great because it will be able to keep some of those references. However, in practice, I've noticed that it doesn't work universally. So it's very much dependent on what you delete or what you get rid of. So you can see I got rid of that arc there, and the rest of this is still fully defined, but these edges can sort of float around. So there are some notable improvements there, but again, I think that it's kind of a case-by-case basis. The other thing, or the last thing that's changed, and I'm going to turn off the two sides, is we now can offset from an offset. Now, this might seem like a simple thing, but this was a giant pain before. If you wanted to create multiple offsets, you would have to always go back to the original, and then you'd have to offset it a larger distance. So now being able to offset an offset is something that is, again, another welcomed improvement. So big changes for that. They did also fix a problem where offsetting from projected geometry failed on a geometry update. That's supposed to be fixed now. I haven't ever encountered that problem, so I can't honestly tell you if it is fixed or not. But again, big improvements to the offset tool, probably the one tool that got the most amount of attention. So let's move on a little bit to parameters while we're talking about sketches. So parameters have gotten a few updates, and the most notable update for me is honestly the ability to import and export them. Now, in the past, there are add-ins that you could download that would allow you to import or export the CSVs. Basically, what it would do is it would run a macro and it would just build out the user parameters. But now it's built into Fusion and we don't have to do that anymore. Keep in mind that if you create equations inside of dimensions, those will not be exported. Only user parameters created inside of the parameters dialog with custom names, those are the ones that are going to be exported. But basically, we have these two buttons here. We can figure out if we want to save it to the cloud or save it locally. And then what we want to do is I'm just going to create a new file. I'm going to go into change parameters, and we're going to import that. So again, I'm going to go to my local file, and it's going to go through. We can pick which ones we want to import. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And it's going to give me the status, and then I'm going to say import. And now my new design contains all of those parameters. So what this allows us to do is to generate parameters that are common for things like our injection molded designs, if we want standard draft and wall thickness. And we can just export those as a parameter that we can import that CSV file, basically. So it gives us the ability to build out these sort of complex templates, even though we don't have a traditional template file, and we can bring that data in. So that's a really nice improvement. One of the other things that they've changed, which honestly I never thought was a big deal, but something that has been improved. In the past, if you were creating a dimension, you could type in DIA for diameter and you could put equals 100, and that would create a parameter name. But what they've done now, and I'm going to go ahead and show this by just adding a dimension here. So what we can do now is give this a new name. We still have to follow the same rules and put equals, and it'll allow us to create that parameter without affecting the dimension. So is this a big deal? Probably not. In the past, basically, we would just have to redo the entire thing. And once again, the way that this works is you are not creating a user parameter. What you're doing is you're creating a favorite saved value. So this is different than a user parameter. This still appears in the sketch. And what ends up happening is it basically just it adds the star and it puts it in your favorites list. So if you're trying to do this to import or export parameters, it's not going to help you. You really still do need to create those user parameters globally inside of that dialog first. But those are the improvements that we have to the parameters. Next, let's talk a little bit about configurations. We did a small series on this channel about configuring parts and assemblies and drawings. And this was one of our example parts, which I've changed just a little bit. And the reason I've changed it is because the addition to configurations, well, a couple of additions, but this configuration addition is about joints. Now, in the past, what we'd have to do if we had a configured assembly is we'd have to have a bunch of duplicate joints and suppress them and unsuppress the ones that we needed each time we made a configuration change. Now we have the ability to configure a joint directly, but there are some limitations here as well that we want to talk about. So in order to configure a joint, it has to be a joint and not an as-built joint. So you can see this revolute here. We have the ability to change the snap location, the angle, alignment. We can flip the orientation if we need to. And all of this is great. I'm going to hit cancel and close that out. And this other revolute joint, if I go to configure, you'll notice that it doesn't give us the same options. So this, much like the option in here to duplicate with joints, this only works if it's a joint and not an as-built joint. So you have to have had selected the location, the snap point, or the joint origin in order to use this functionality. So this is great, but it really lends itself more to designs that are created externally to each other. If you're building out a design and you're creating everything internal to one file, and let's say they're components or bodies, it doesn't really matter. But if you're doing that all internal and you're using as-built joints, unfortunately, you can't use this functionality. You have to use a joint to make it work. So unfortunately, to me, that's a negative. It's still nice to be able to configure these joints. I wish that there was a way to use as-built joints, but I understand the limitation in the software. Again, the same reason we can't use duplicate with joints on as-built joints, because they don't need or they don't require you to select a joint origin location, and that's a critical aspect of how the functionality works in the back end. So those are some updates to configurations. There are also some updates I'm not going to cover about configurations, and mainly the ability to copy a study in simulation and generative design and copy a configuration and bring those study parameters over to a new config. So in the past, basically what we would do is we would create a new study in simulation or a new configuration, which is not the right term anymore in generative design. And then basically we would copy over all the settings from our studies and make changes. Now we can do that with true configurations, which is kind of a nice option if you do use simulation or generative design. There are other changes to simulation and GD that I'm not getting into, but if you are using those common or like all the time, then make sure you do check into that. There are some new options for shape optimizations, got some updates. There are new load types in generative design for linear and angular global loads, and just some other basic improvements. So the last thing that I think I'm going to cover in this video, actually, let's take that back. Let's take one step back. There are some other changes to external components and the way that they deal with grounding to the parent. So with ground to parent, when you create a new component in a design, the first component is automatically grounded to parent. The second component is free. It's free to move about. If you have multiple components grounded to parent, Basically, what ends up happening is when you try to apply joints, you get into this situation where it's not valid because all the components are grounded. So if you use this ground to parent functionality and you are applying joints, what's changed now is the ability to unground the component that you want to move. So basically what happens is it automatically will unground one of those components to parent. The way that this functionality works when you're applying joints is the first component that you select is the component that's going to move to the second location that you select. So the order of operations is important here. Again, personally, I'm not a big fan of this ground to parent functionality. I understand where it's going and I understand why it's there. But generally, when I'm modeling for myself, I go to preferences and I turn that option off. In the design, I turn off the first component ground to parent, and I just manually do it if I need to. So just keep in mind if you are using that, this has been a change to that functionality. Another thing that's changed that it's kind of along the same lines is when we're creating a new component, generally these are, they default to internal components, meaning they're saved in the same design that we're working on. If you are creating external components, if that works for your own personal workflow, they've changed it or they've updated it now so that it automatically goes to the same project location as the current parent design. So that wasn't the case in the past. If the parent design is not saved, then it'll go to the project. But just keep in mind that basically what happens now is if you are creating external components in a saved design, they'll all be in the same location, in the same subfolder, however you organize your design. So that is helpful. It keeps you from having to go and find that location and put components where you want. The last thing that I want to point out in here before we hop into drawings is they've now changed it so that at the very top of the Fusion window, if you're not running full screen mode, then you're going to see the name of your current design, the version, the work hub location, and if it's not saved, you'll have the asterisk next to it, just like you see on the tab here. And then it says Autodesk Fusion after that. Why that's there, I'm guessing just because it's once you get multiple tabs open, you can see that the names start to get truncated. So it's just a good way for you to be able to see that. However, I'm not sure how helpful it is because the only way that you'll be able to see that full name is if you have the design selected. So you can also just hover over the tab and see the same thing. So I guess it's a good update, but I don't really see a huge need for it to be there, but it has changed. So I thought I'd mention it. All right, so the last things that I want to cover in this video, because we're already about 20 minutes in or getting there, is some updates to drawings. So there are two main updates here that I want to talk about. The first update has to do with delimiters. And what I mean by that is up until now, we could only have the sort of full stop period for our delimiters. And I know for a lot of users, especially international users, that's not how you represent the numbers. So in our document settings, in this first section, we now have this delimiter and we can change it to comma. So this allows us to change the way that our numbers are displayed more in line with the way that you do it in whatever location you're working from. So the other things that I want to mention here, and we're not going to dive too deep into it, but there are some automation settings tucked away in our drawing document settings. And the reason that this is important is because if you're creating your own drawing templates, you can use those drawing templates when you're using automated drawings. We will do some content on automated drawings in the near future. I just haven't quite gotten around to it. But the main thing that I want to point out here is that inside of our document settings, we have options for our dimension strategy, and the dimension strategy is going to be based on our sheet type. And the reason this is important is because if you're making a drawing sheet for a main assembly or a sub-assembly, your dimensioning pattern or your dimensioning scheme is likely going to be different than, say, a flat sheet metal component. So if you're using a flat sheet metal component, you may want to push it to use an ordinate style dimension scheme. And if you're building out your templates, then you can configure these document settings based on your own specific purpose or need. So again, I'm not going to get into all those differences because we're not talking about drawing templates here, but just note that this is a new change or a new addition. You can now create your document settings based on your sheet type, and you can provide a specific dimensioning strategy. In this case, you can make it automatic, you can make it ordnance, chain, whatever the case might be for the types of models that you're working with. So with all those, again, there are a lot of other updates that have happened. I think I covered pretty much everything that happened in the design and drawing workspaces, but there are updates to things like the design rule check interface and the engine that actually runs that in electronics. There are some updates to imports from KiCad version 7 and 8, which will automatically create a native Fusion format, from what I understand. I don't use KiCad, so I haven't tested that. And again, there are updates to simulation, generative design, as well as a lot of updates in the manufacturing workspace. But if you have any questions on anything you saw here or anything else, please leave a comment and let me know. If you are interested in all of those other updates, again, I'll put the link in the description, but you can always go to your help menu and click on what's new. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.